The year is 1924. Listen to the wind. It does not howl, it screams. It is a terrifying primal sound, the voice of a historic cyclonic bomb tearing through the jagged peaks of the valley, burying the world under a suffocating blanket of white. The temperature outside has plummeted to a catastrophic minus 30 degrees. It is the kind of cold that does not merely bite the skin, it shatters the bones. It freezes the sap inside the ancient pines until their trunks explode in the dark like cannon fire. It is a night where nature reclaims her absolute dominance over the fragile illusions of mankind. High upon the overlooking hill, inside a sprawling three-story stone mansion, the illusion of wealth is violently collapsing. Reginald Sterling, the valley's wealthiest merchant and the self-proclaimed master of industry, stands shivering in the center of his grand foyer. He is wrapped in 3 layers of imported velvet and heavy wool, yet his teeth chatter uncontrollably. His breath forms thick, white clouds in his own hallway. Surrounding him is a monument to modern arrogance, a massive $4,500 imported cast-iron boiler system installed by the city's most expensive engineers. It was supposed to be a triumph of modern mechanics, a fiery beast fed by mountains of expensive, hoarded coal that would make a mockery of the winter. But the beast is dead. The extreme, unprecedented drop in temperature froze the external ventilation shafts. The condensation inside the elaborate, expensive copper pipes crystallized into solid ice, expanding with immense hydraulic pressure until the metal violently ruptured. The basement is flooded with freezing water, the coal is soaked and useless, and the extravagant $4,500 machine is now nothing more than a giant, freezing block of dead iron. Reginald Sterling, a man who believed that paper money and gold coins could purchase immunity from the laws of nature, is watching his world turn to ice. His grand mansion, built to showcase his superiority, has become a beautiful, freezing tomb. He clutches his useless money, realizing for the first time in his arrogant life that dollars cannot be burned for warmth, and gold does not radiate heat. Now let the pendulum swing. Deep down in the lowest, most vulnerable part of the valley, completely exposed to the merciless whipping of the blizzard, sits a dilapidated, drafty wooden cabin. The roof sags, the timber is ancient and gray, and the cracks in the walls are stuffed with dried mud and moss. It is the home of Ayla, a 16-year-old girl who possesses nothing but the clothes on her back and the terrifying responsibility of keeping her frail, 7-year-old brother, Toby, alive. Toby lies on a small cot, his lungs weak from a lingering winter sickness. By all the laws of Reginald Sterling's cruel, money-driven world, this cabin should be a graveyard. Without a cent to her name, without a single lump of coal, without a roaring hearth or a modern boiler, this teenage girl and her little brother should have frozen to death hours ago in the minus 30-degree white hell. Yet, inside the cabin, there is profound, absolute peace. Toby is fast asleep. He is not shivering. His breathing is steady, his chest rising and falling in a calm, rhythmic slumber. He has kicked off his heaviest blanket because, miraculously, the air inside this fragile wooden shell is warm. It is not boiling, but it is a stable, life-saving 45 degrees. That is a staggering 75-degree difference from the lethal void outside. There is no fire burning, there is no expensive machinery humming in the background. The total financial cost of the heating system keeping these 2 orphans alive is exactly $0.00. $0.00. Surrounding Toby's bed, standing like silent, rusted sentinels in the dim candlelight, are 10 salvaged, 55-gallon steel barrels. They are battered, dented, and ugly. Ayla dragged them from the scrapyard with her own blistered hands. And what is inside them? Not oil, not coal, not magical chemicals. They are filled to the brim with freezing river water. While the arrogant men on the hill watch their expensive empires freeze, this humble 16-year-old girl is using the very process of freezing to generate heat. She has harnessed a deeply counterintuitive, almost magical law of thermodynamics known as latent heat. As the water inside those 10 barrels fights the creeping cold, as it slowly surrenders and begins to turn into ice, it must release an immense amount of thermal energy into the surrounding air. The freezing water is actively breathing warmth into the cabin, acting as a massive invisible shield of thermal radiation. Nature's physics, free and eternal, is gently protecting the innocent while simultaneously humiliating the elite. But how did a marginalized teenager, cast aside by society, discover a scientific principle so profound that it outsmarted the wealthiest engineers in the land? How did she know that bringing thousands of pounds of freezing water into her home would be the key to their survival? to understand this triumph of ancestral wisdom, to witness the cruel mockery she endured before the storm, and to learn the lost science of latent heat, we must step back. We must rewind the clock exactly 72 hours, to the moment the dark clouds first gathered over the jagged peaks, and Ayla realized that no one in this cruel world was coming to save them. Before we journey back into the freezing winds of 1924 to witness Ayla's extraordinary fight for survival, I ask you to pause for a moment. We are the guardians of forgotten knowledge, preserving the wisdom that modern arrogance tries to erase. If you value these stories of resilience, physics, and poetic justice, please subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and share this video with someone who appreciates true survival. And tell me in the comments below, from which city and country are you watching this story today? Let us build our community of knowledge. 72 hours before the sky collapsed and the white hell descended upon the valley, the air already tasted of iron and impending doom. The oldest pines in the forest stood perfectly still, holding their breath. Animals had vanished. The clouds rolling over the jagged peaks were not white or gray. They were a bruised, violent purple, heavy with a catastrophic amount of moisture and freezing winds. The barometers in the town square were plummeting so fast that the glass dials seemed to tremble. The old men of the village, those who remembered the deadly freezes of their grandfather's time, locked their doors and began to pray. A historic cyclonic bomb was coming. Inside her drafty, crumbling wooden cabin on the absolute fringes of society, 16-year-old Ayla felt the sudden, terrifying drop in the air pressure in her very bones. She turned her gaze to the corner of the single room. Her 7-year-old brother, Toby, lay under a thin, patchwork quilt. He coughed, a dry, rattling sound that echoed off the bare wooden walls. His lungs were already fighting a deep winter infection. His fragile body had absolutely no reserves of fat or strength to survive a sudden plunge into sub-zero temperatures. Ayla walked over to their small cast-iron stove. She opened the rusty door. Inside, there was nothing but cold, gray ash. She checked the wood box beside the door. 3 small splinters of pine, that was all. She reached into her apron pocket, her cold fingers searching for a miracle, but she found exactly what she knew she would find. Nothing, not a single copper coin. $0. The world they lived in dictated a cruel, absolute law. Warmth belongs exclusively to those who can buy it. To be poor in the winter is to be condemned to the ice. Desperation is a powerful force, but when motivated by the love for a vulnerable child, it becomes an unstoppable will. Ayla wrapped her frayed woolen shawl tightly around her thin shoulders and stepped out into the biting, pre-storm wind. She had to walk 3 miles into the wealthy center of the valley to beg for scraps. The contrast in the town square was a sickening display of human arrogance and gluttony. Outside the grand, stone-walled estate of Reginald Sterling, a massive logistical operation was underway. 4 heavy horse-drawn wagons, their axles groaning under the weight, were dumping tons of premium, glistening black anthracite coal into the mansion's deep cellar. Surrounding the wagons were Sterling's hired engineers, men in tailored woolen suits and thick spectacles, holding blueprints and barking orders. They had just finished installing the crown jewel of Sterling's empire, a $4,500 imported steel and iron boiler system. It was a mechanical monster designed to consume massive amounts of expensive fuel and blast artificial heat through a complex network of copper pipes. Ayla approached the iron gates, her boots worn thin, her hands trembling from the cold. She did not ask for the premium coal. She was too humble for that. She only asked one of the foremen for the sweepings, the useless, crushed coal dust left on the floor of the wagons. Just enough to create a slow-burning smudge in her stove to keep her brother's heart beating. Reginald Sterling himself, wrapped in a luxurious fur coat, stepped out onto his grand porch. He looked down at the teenage girl with eyes that held no compassion, only the cold calculus of a ledger book. "Charity breeds weakness, girl," he sneered, his voice carrying over the sound of dumping coal. "If you cannot afford fuel, you have failed the basic test of industry. Nature is culling the weak today. Go home." The engineers chuckled. One of them, a man named Dr. Vance, who proudly wore a pin from a prestigious city university, looked at Ayla's thin shawl and shook his head in absolute disdain. "Perhaps she can simply wish herself warm," he mocked, "since she clearly lacks the intellect or the capital to harness modern combustion." Driven away, humiliated but not defeated, Ayla did not weep. She had no time for tears. Tears would only freeze on her cheeks. As she walked away from the roaring engines of the rich, a quiet, ancient memory surfaced in her mind. A lesson whispered by her late grandfather, a humble man of the earth who understood that nature does not demand money. She demands understanding. He had taught her that water, the very element of ice, possessed a hidden, almost magical reservoir of energy. She altered her path. She did not go to the forest to search for wet, impossible-to-burn twigs. Instead, she went to the town's abandoned scrapyard. Buried under a layer of early frost, she found them, 10 heavy, discarded 55-gallon steel barrels. They were rusted, dented, and completely worthless to the men of industry. They cost exactly $0. For the next 6 hours, Ayla engaged in a grueling, agonizing test of physical endurance. She rolled the heavy steel barrels one by one 3 miles back to her cabin. Her muscles screamed, her palms blistered and bled, leaving rusty, crimson smears on the cold steel. But she did not stop. Once the 10 barrels were arranged in a tight circle around Toby's small bed, she grabbed 2 wooden buckets and ran to the freezing, fast-moving river behind her cabin. Bucket by bucket, gallon by gallon, she began to fill the barrels with freezing water. Plunging her hands into the icy river, hauling the agonizing weight back up the muddy bank, pouring it into the steel drums. Over and over, 550 gallons of freezing water, carried by the sheer willpower of a 16-year-old girl fighting for her brother's life. It was during her 50th trip to the river that a sleek, enclosed carriage pulled up on the dirt road near her cabin. It was Reginald Sterling and his chief engineer, Dr. Vance, taking a final tour of the valley to gloat over their preparations before the storm hit. They looked out the glass window and saw Ayla shivering violently, pouring buckets of icy river water into a barrel placed right next to her brother's bed. Sterling ordered the carriage to halt. He rolled down the window, a cruel smile twisting his face. "What manner of insanity is this?" he called out, his voice dripping with condescension. Ayla stopped, her breath forming ragged clouds in the freezing air. She looked at the wealthy merchant, her eyes steady. "I'm preparing the heat," she said quietly. "For the storm." Dr. Vance erupted into a loud, theatrical laugh that echoed off the pine trees. It was the laugh of an educated man mocking a perceived savage. "Heat? With river water?" he shouted, leaning out of the carriage. "You foolish, ignorant girl. Are you entirely devoid of common sense? The water in that river is barely 33 degrees. It is practically ice. When the temperature drops tonight, that water will freeze solid. You are bringing a glacier into your home. You are turning your shack into an icebox." Vance turned to Sterling, shaking his head in theatrical disbelief. "This is what happens when peasants ignore modern science. She thinks bringing freezing water indoors will save her. It will accelerate their demise. Water freezes, child. It gets cold. If you want heat, you must have fire. You must have combustion. You need our $4,500 boiler, which you obviously cannot afford. You are effectively burying your brother in a tomb of ice." Ayla stood entirely still in the biting wind, holding the empty wooden bucket. She did not raise her voice. She did not try to argue with the men in the carriage. She knew that arrogant men, blinded by their wealth and their loud, expensive machines, only understood brute force. They only understood burning things, destroying resources to create heat. They were entirely blind to the invisible, elegant, and deeply powerful laws of the earth. She looked at Dr. Vance, the man of modern science, and quietly spoke words that he would remember for the rest of his life. "You know how to burn money?" she said, her voice a soft, steady hum beneath the rising wind. "But you do not know how water breathes?" Sterling scoffed in disgust, rolling up the glass window. "Let the ice claim them," he muttered. The carriage sped away, rushing back toward the stone mansion, toward the mountains of coal and the massive iron boiler, leaving the vulnerable girl alone as the first violent flakes of the cyclonic bomb began to fall from the blackened sky. They laughed at her poverty. They laughed at her ignorance. But physics does not care about money, and thermodynamics does not listen to the laughter of arrogant men. The first true howl of the cyclonic bomb struck the valley floor, just as Ayla barred the heavy wooden door of her fragile cabin. It was not a gradual shift in weather. It was a violent, physical blow. The ancient timber walls groaned, and the single glass pane of the window instantly frosted over, sealing them inside a dark, isolated world. Outside, the temperature was already in a terrifying freefall, plunging toward minus 30 degrees. The air was becoming a weapon. Ayla stood in the center of the dim room, her chest heaving, her breath still visible in the cold air. Her hands were raw, bleeding from the friction of the rusted metal and the biting frost of the river. She looked at her hands, then at the sleeping face of little Toby. He was pale, his chest rising with a fragile rhythm. Around his small wooden cot stood the 10 55-gallon steel barrels, forming a silent, heavy barricade. 550 gallons of freezing dark river water, a monument of desperation or a masterpiece of survival. Dr. Vance, the educated engineer in his tailored suit, had laughed at this. He had called her a foolish, ignorant girl for bringing a glacier into her home. To the arrogant minds of men who only understand the world through the lens of commerce and combustion, heat is something you must violently extract from the earth by burning coal or oil. To them, warmth requires a transaction. It requires a $4,500 iron boiler. It requires destruction. But Ayla was not relying on combustion. She was relying on something infinitely older, far more elegant, and entirely free. She was relying on the physics of water and the quiet, ancestral wisdom of her grandfather. Years ago, before the deep winters took him, her grandfather had been a humble laborer who worked the distant southern orchards. He was a man who owned nothing, yet understood the invisible mechanics of the earth better than any university scholar. Ayla remembered sitting by his feet as he carved wood, listening to him explain the greatest paradox of the cold. When the frost comes to kill the orange blossoms, he had told her, his voice low and full of reverence, the farmers do not build fires. Fires are greedy and burn out. Instead, they spray the fragile fruit with water. They cover the delicate blossoms in a blanket of ice to save them from freezing. It sounded like madness. How could ice protect against the cold? But her grandfather had taught her the secret of the phase change, a miraculous law of thermodynamics that the arrogant engineers on the hill had entirely overlooked in their obsession with steam and coal. As the temperature inside the drafty cabin began to drop, matching the lethal plunge outside, the water inside those 10 rusted barrels reached 32 degrees Fahrenheit. At this precise moment, water faces a fundamental choice. To surrender its liquid state and crystallize into solid ice, it must undergo a profound physical transformation, and nature demands a toll for this transformation. To turn from 32-degree liquid water into 32-degree solid ice, every single pound of that water must forcefully eject a massive amount of hidden energy into the surrounding environment. In the science of thermodynamics, this is called the latent heat of fusion. Let us understand the magnificent scale of this invisible fire. When you heat water, it takes exactly 1 British thermal unit, 1 BTU, to raise the temperature of 1 pound of water by 1 single degree. But when water changes state, when it crosses the threshold from liquid to solid, the math explodes. To freeze just 1 pound of water, it must release an astonishing 144 BTUs of thermal energy into the air. Ayla had not brought 1 pound of water into her cabin. Through grueling, agonizing labor, she had hauled 550 gallons, that is roughly 4,587 pounds of water. Do the math that the wealthy Dr. Vance failed to do. Multiply 4,587 pounds by 144 BTUs. As that water slowly, inevitably freezes throughout the brutal night, it will release over 660,000 BTUs of pure thermal energy into the tiny cabin. It is the exact heating equivalent of burning dozens of pounds of premium, expensive coal in a blazing furnace. But there is no smoke to choke Toby's fragile lungs. There is no fire hazard. There is no need to constantly feed a hungry, $4,500 mechanical beast. And most importantly, the fuel cost exactly $0.00. The 10 rusted steel barrels act as a colossal thermal battery. The metal, highly conductive, immediately transfers the heat from the freezing water into the air. As the vicious cyclonic bomb outside tries to drag the cabin's internal temperature down to a deadly -30, the water fights back. Every time the air in the room drops below freezing, the water accelerates its crystallization, releasing a massive wave of latent heat. It is a slow, silent, invisible battle. The cold attacks and the water bleeds warmth to defend the space. Because there is such a massive volume of water, it cannot freeze all at once. It will take days for 550 gallons to freeze solid. And for every second of those days, as long as there is still liquid water turning into ice inside those barrels, the ambient temperature immediately surrounding them simply cannot drop significantly below freezing. Ayla pulled a wooden chair close to Toby's bed, sitting within the protective circle of the steel drums. She reached out and placed her bare, blistered hand against the side of the nearest barrel. The metal was cold to the touch, yes, but the air radiating off it, circulating in the small enclosed space, was a stable, life-saving pocket of thermal resistance. The freezing water was actively breathing warmth over her little brother. She listened to the wind outside. It was no longer a scream. It was a deafening roar, a catastrophic force tearing trees from their roots and ripping shingles from roofs. She imagined Reginald Sterling in his stone mansion, surrounded by his engineers, their faith placed entirely in the arrogant mechanics of wealth. They believed they could buy their way out of nature's wrath. They believed their expensive copper pipes and imported iron could conquer the absolute zero. Ayla closed her eyes, pulling her frayed shawl tighter. She did not have wealth. She did not have a university pin. But she had the earth, she had water, and she had the profound, unbreakable will of a sister protecting her blood. While the rich men blindly trusted their fragile machines, this 16-year-old girl had turned the very weapon of winter, the freezing of water, into an absolute shield. The white hell raged against the thin wooden walls, but inside the circle of rusted steel, the temperature held firm, 45 degrees. A fortress of invisible fire, built with $0, zero arrogance, and an infinite understanding of the natural world. Now the storm was reaching its absolute peak, and as the night deepened, the brutal, unforgiving pendulum of winter was about to swing violently toward the men on the hill, ready to test the true strength of their expensive artificial world. By midnight, the cyclonic bomb swallowed the valley entirely. The temperature outside plummeted past -30, crashing violently toward -40 degrees Fahrenheit. This was no longer a winter storm. It was a meteorological leviathan, an atmospheric apex predator designed to hunt down and extinguish any fragile spark of heat. Now, feel the pendulum swing. High on the hill, Reginald Sterling's 3-story stone mansion is under siege. The wind does not blow. It strikes the granite walls like a runaway freight train. Inside the cavernous basement, the pride of modern engineering, the $4,500 imported cast-iron boiler, is screaming. Dr. Vance, his tailored suit now stained with soot, is frantically shoveling expensive anthracite coal into the roaring belly of the beast. The dials on the brass pressure gauges are trembling wildly. The system is designed to conquer nature through sheer, brute force combustion, pumping boiling water through hundreds of feet of intricate, expensive copper piping. But the system is deeply flawed. It is arrogant. It assumes an infinite supply of oxygen and a controlled environment. It assumes nature will play by the rules of human commerce. The pendulum swings back to the valley floor. Inside the fragile, rotting wooden walls of Ayla's cabin, there is no screaming metal. There is no frantic shoveling of coal. There is only the deep, rhythmic breathing of a 7-year-old boy and the absolute, profound silence of nature performing its oldest magic. The wind howls furiously outside, tearing at the shingles, but the sheer, colossal mass of the 550 gallons of water acts as an acoustic dampener. 4,500 pounds of liquid mass absorbs the violent vibrations of the storm. Ayla sits in the dark, her hands resting quietly on her lap. She is not fighting the cold, she is letting the cold fight itself. As the ambient air in the cabin tries to freeze, it touches the surface of the water in the 10 rusted $0 steel barrels. And at that exact microscopic boundary, a miracle of thermodynamics occurs. The liquid water begins to crystallize, transforming into delicate geometric patterns of ice. And with every single ounce that freezes, it exhales a breath of pure, invisible thermal energy, a portion of those massive 660,000 BTUs of latent heat pushing back against the encroaching frost. The cabin remains a steady, peaceful 45 degrees. The pendulum violently swings upward. Panic erupts in the mansion. The catastrophic drop in external temperature has frozen the boiler's intake vents solid. Deprived of oxygen, the massive coal fire inside the $4,500 iron beast begins to choke. Dr. Vance screams orders, but his voice is drowned out by the agonizing metallic groan of the system failing. As the fire dies, the water circulating inside the sprawling network of copper pipes abruptly stops moving. And stationary water in -40-degree ambient cold obeys only one master, physics. Water possesses a unique, devastating property. When it turns to ice, it expands by exactly 9% of its volume. It is an unstoppable hydraulic force. Snap, crack, bang. The sounds echo through the mansion like rifle fire. The expensive imported copper pipes, brittle from the extreme cold, violently rupture inside the walls. Freezing, blackened water explodes into the grand foyer, soaking the Persian rugs, flooding the velvet furniture, and pouring down the grand staircase like a necrotic waterfall. The pendulum descends softly into the darkness. Ayla stands up from her wooden chair. She holds a single flickering candle and walks slowly around the perimeter of Toby's cot. She peers into the first steel barrel. A thin, translucent sheet of ice has formed across the top of the water. To an ignorant mind, this would look like failure. To Dr. Vance, this would look like the tomb he predicted. But Ayla knows the truth. She knows that this thin layer of ice is the physical proof of her salvation. It means the phase change is actively happening. Below that crust of ice, Hundreds of gallons of water are still liquid, still fighting the drop in temperature, still bleeding out 144 BTUs per pound. Furthermore, that top layer of ice now acts as an insulating lid, slowing the freezing process of the water beneath it, ensuring the release of latent heat is measured, steady, and prolonged. It is an automatic, self-regulating thermal engine designed by the universe itself. Cost, $0. Efficiency, absolute. Toby shifts in his sleep, completely untouched by the apocalyptic white hell raging just inches beyond the wooden planks. The pendulum swings for the final devastating time toward the hill, total mechanical collapse. The $4,500 boiler is dead, transformed into a giant freezing block of cracked iron. The basement is flooded with 2 feet of icy water, completely ruining the massive stockpile of premium coal. Reginald Sterling, the master of industry, stands in his grand hallway surrounded by the shattered ruins of his artificial warmth. The temperature inside the grand stone mansion is plummeting with terrifying speed. 60 degrees, 40 degrees, 20 degrees, 10 degrees. The grand stone walls, lacking any true thermal mass or passive solar design, act like a massive refrigerator, trapping the bitter cold inside. Sterling's breath forms thick, ragged clouds. His expensive imported fur coat cannot stop the deep, penetrating chill from freezing his blood. Dr. Vance is curled on the floor, shivering violently, his university pin useless, his understanding of thermodynamics proven catastrophically inadequate. They are freezing to death inside a monument to their own wealth. They had mocked the earth. They had laughed at the water. They had placed their absolute faith in paper money and mechanical complexity. And now, the absolute zero of the cyclonic bomb was extracting its toll. Nature does not negotiate with ledgers, and the winter wind cares nothing for gold. As the frostbite begins to numb Sterling's fingers and toes, a horrifying realization washes over him. His money is dead. His machines are dead. His engineers are paralyzed by the cold. If they remain in this dark, freezing stone tomb, they will be corpses by sunrise. There is no fire left in the wealthy center of the valley. In the darkest, most desperate corner of his freezing mind, a single humiliating image appears. He remembers the teenage girl. He remembers her bleeding hands hauling rusted steel barrels from the scrapyard. He remembers the quiet, unbreakable certainty in her voice when she said, "I am preparing the heat." Sterling looks at Vance, his lips blue, his teeth chattering so violently he can barely form the words. The ultimate humiliation of the elite has arrived. The men who owned everything, the men who laughed at the primitive, the men who believed they were gods of industry, are now forced to face the agonizing truth. To survive the night, they must abandon their shattered palace. They must crawl through the lethal -40-degree white hell, and they must beg for their lives at the door of the very girl they threw out into the snow. The storm rages on, blinding and merciless. But down in the valley, inside a rotting wooden shack, a steady 45-degree warmth continues to radiate from the freezing water, a silent, triumphant testament to the invincible power of ancestral wisdom. Dawn broke over the valley not with a warm golden light, but with a pale, suffocating gray. The cyclonic bomb had passed its absolute peak, leaving behind a landscape completely unrecognizable. The world was entombed in a devastating, unbroken silence. The ancient pines were completely stripped of their needles, encased in thick armor of solid ice. The roads were buried under 6 feet of drifting, compacted snow, and stumbling through this lethal -40-degree white hell were 2 figures, stripped of all their worldly majesty. Reginald Sterling, the master of industry, and Dr. Vance, the university-educated engineer. Their expensive leather boots were frozen stiff. Their imported wool and fur coats were heavily caked with rime and ice. They did not walk like conquerors. They crawled like broken, defeated animals. Their faces were an ashen, sickly blue, their breath coming in shallow, agonizing gasps. The $4,500 mechanical beast that was supposed to protect them had violently failed, becoming a flooded, ruptured tomb of useless iron. The money in their pockets was completely powerless against the absolute zero of the frozen wind. They dragged themselves toward the lowest, most marginalized point of the valley, toward the rotting wooden shack they had mocked just hours before. Sterling's hands were completely numb, locked into frozen claws. He could not even raise his fist to knock. He simply fell against the heavy wooden door of Ayla's cabin, his weight pushing it open an inch, and through that single, narrow crack in the ancient wood, a miracle poured out. It was not a blazing inferno. It was not the suffocating dry heat of a coal furnace. It was a gentle, steady, perfectly stable wave of 45-degree thermal radiation. To a man actively dying of hypothermia in -40-degree weather, an 85-degree difference is not just warmth, it is the physical breath of life. It felt like walking into a radiant, sunlit sanctuary. Ayla stood near the center of the room. She did not hold a weapon. She did not hold a ledger. She quietly pulled the heavy door fully open, stepping aside. The two men collapsed onto the rough wooden floorboards. They lay there, shivering violently, weeping silently as the agonizing, beautiful warmth began to thaw their frozen blood. Slowly, Dr. Vance lifted his heavy, frost-covered head. His eyes, completely devoid of their former arrogance, scanned the small room. There was no fire in the rusted iron stove. There was no expensive fuel. In the dim morning light, he saw the little 7-year-old boy, Toby, sleeping peacefully under a thin patchwork quilt, breathing easily, completely untouched by the catastrophe outside. And surrounding the boy's cot, standing like a silent, invincible fortress, were the 10 dented, rusted steel barrels. Vance pushed himself up on his elbows, staring intently at the barrels. He saw the thick layer of solid ice that had formed across the top of the water. He saw the frost gripping the outside of the steel. And in that quiet, desperate moment, the profound, earth-shattering reality of physics crushed his educated ego into absolute dust. His university mind finally did the math that his arrogance had previously blocked. 550 gallons of water, over 4,500 pounds of mass. Dropping below 32 degrees, the latent heat of fusion. 144 BTUs of thermal energy forcefully expelled into the room for every single pound of water that crystallized into ice. "My God," Vance whispered, his voice cracking, his breath no longer forming clouds in the warm air. "It is a thermal battery. The water is freezing so that you do not have to." He looked at Ayla, the marginalized, uneducated 16-year-old girl. He remembered his cruel laughter. He remembered calling her a foolish peasant for bringing a glacier into her home. He realized now that she had harnessed a deeply counterintuitive, magnificent law of thermodynamics that had vastly outperformed his expensive, brittle, $4,500 imported boiler. She had manipulated the phase change of matter itself, and it had cost her exactly $0. Reginald Sterling, still trembling on the floor, looked up at Ayla. He waited for the mockery. He waited for the teenage girl to demand payment, to humiliate them, to exact the cruel revenge that a man of his ruthless nature would exact if the roles were reversed. He braced himself for the scorn, but Ayla simply walked over to the corner, picked up a single dry woolen blanket, and draped it silently over the shivering millionaire. "Water does not judge," Ayla said quietly, her voice carrying the ancient solemn weight of her grandfather's wisdom. "It does not care if you wear silk or rags. It does not care if you have gold in your vaults or dust in your pockets. The earth only asks that you understand her. You tried to fight the winter with arrogance and fire. I simply asked the water to share its hidden warmth." She walked back to her brother's side, resting her hand on the cold steel of a barrel that was still actively bleeding invisible heat into the room. "You may stay here until the roads are cleared, Mr. Sterling. The ice will protect us all." In that profound silence, the ultimate justice was served. It was not a justice of violence or vengeance. It was the sublime, poetic justice of nature, the absolute humiliation of the elite, forced to owe their very lives to the profound, free, ancestral wisdom of the marginalized girl they had thrown into the cold. The illusion of their mechanical superiority was completely shattered. The legacy of the earth had won. The story of the freezing water barrels is not just a lesson in thermodynamics, latent heat, and the thermal mass of $0 salvaged materials. It is a fundamental manifesto of human existence. True resilience is not found in expensive catalogs, imported machinery, or the arrogant belief that we can conquer the natural world with money. True resilience is found in humility, in the quiet observation of physics, and in the profound, forgotten wisdom of those who work the earth with their own hands. When the complex systems fail, when the copper pipes burst, when the supply chains freeze, it is the ancient, simple, unshakable laws of the universe that will keep our families alive. If you felt the warmth of this story and the deep justice of this survival, do not let this knowledge fade into the cold. We are building a community of resistance, a fortress of ancestral wisdom against the arrogance of the modern, disposable world. I ask you to subscribe to the channel, leave your like to strengthen our voice, and share this video with someone who truly understands the value of resilience and humility. And please tell me in the comments, from which city and country are you helping us preserve this legacy today? Stand firm, respect the earth, and never forget that true power cannot be bought.